Wonderful.
I see I'm muted. Hi. Hi to everybody.
Yes. All right. Welcome. Welcome, everyone, to What Changed on November 5th. My name is Michelle Jordan, and I'm glad you're here. The League of Women Voters encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League is a nonpartisan political organization, nonpartisan in that it never supports or opposes any candidates or political party. Tonight's event will be recorded. There will be a Q&A at the end. I'm hoping that you will write your question in the chat, and I will read them out to David. But before we begin, I would like to begin with just a quick housekeeping note. I'd like to remind all of you that on Sunday, December 8th, we will have an event at Maggiano's called The Election Has Happened. What comes next? Professor Dick Simpson will be our speaker. And this is a fundraiser that not only supports the work of LWVE, it also funds our annual ETHS scholarship. So come for the wonderful lunch and the conversation, and perhaps do some holiday shopping afterwards. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. David Orr is a good government advocate, reformer, and politician who served as the Cook County Clerk from 1990 until 2018. He was an alderman for the 49th Ward in the Chicago City Council from 79 to 90. And you may not know it, but he was mayor of Chicago. From November 25th to December 2nd, he was the acting mayor of Chicago following the death of Mayor Harold Washington. He retired from the county clerk at 2018, and I'm nearly certain he has been honored by nearly every good government group that exists in Illinois. He is a powerful and thoughtful voice for good government. Please join me in welcoming David Orr.
Well, thank you, Michelle.
Yes.
Well, since you mentioned the short stint as mayor, I have to tell you my favorite line. Well, I'm the only big city mayor that you'll ever meet that raised no taxes in my entire term. Now, of course, had it been more than 8 days, things might have changed. But I'm glad you asked me to do this because I'm such a big fan of the League of Women Voters. And partly because, as you know, and some of the people out there tonight certainly know a lot about our office, that the county clerk's office deals very closely with the League of Women Voters because two things. One, you're so intimately involved in what we do on election day and leading up to that. And we appreciate all that you do there. In fact, can't really show hands easily on a Zoom like this, but I'm sure many of you were involved in some way in the last election, whether it's as judges or poll watchers or something. The other thing is, which is so nice for us, is that you've been supportive all these years on the public policy changes that collectively we're able to make, including things like, motor voter and early vote and mail voting, teen judge, and we could go on, but a lot of good things that happened over a period of time. In fact, I have this brochure that we did in the office before we left, and we did in 2018. It's basically a brochure about how we help to make Chicago a voter-friendly state. Maybe I'll share that with you, Michelle, at some point. And we don't have a lot of copies left, but I think you'd find it pretty interesting. Talks about what happened, some of the news clippings around some of those things like motor voter or early voting, who the sponsors were, that kind of stuff. Nancy's husband had a lot to do with all of this. And before we get into some other things, just a brief word about before the election, particularly Donald Trump's threat and basically argument that the election was going to be stolen again, or he was going to do his best to fight that. Remember, he was talking about that nearly every day in the last 3 or 4 weeks of the campaign. Now, fortunately, not fortunately that he won, but fortunately, he's no longer talking about challenging the election. But there's a lot of concerns about voter suppression. It's too early yet for us to know what's going on there. But I do want to highlight that we need to follow up because there was a lot of voter suppression taking place. Some was around challenges, and challenges are again, you're sophisticated, so you know this stuff. Challenges are nuances. You know, a good polling place would say, yes, if X person comes in and they've got real data or information as to why someone doesn't live where they claim to live or whatever, that's important. You have to listen to them. But what we were seeing in this last election, at least what we saw in the days before the election, people with all sorts of challenges, but with no information. And in a case like that, the judges have to make the tough decision. Sorry, I appreciate that you were concerned about this, but if you have no proof, we can't let you keep challenging every voter that walks in. Anyway, so that that whole thing, the electoral boards that were kind of taken over politically, how did some of those turn? The citizenship issue in Virginia, that shockingly a court gave a decision to a local state, you know, like just a few days before the election. Normally, judges want to stay away from that. Don't do anything to affect really the elections, you know, at least 30 days out, if not 60. So anyway, that's just something that we'll be looking carefully at in terms of all the potential voter suppressions. So what changed on November 5th? Well, one just brief statement here. The most controversial presidential candidate in our history was elected president, not just via the Electoral College, but with a majority of the voting Americans. Much of the media argued this man ran a campaign filled with racism, misogyny, lies, name-calling, and threatening revenge. But before we get to the questions, I want to run over some points about the elections and where it may be taking us. So I'm just going to go through a number of points that that maybe you've seen in the papers or maybe not. One crucial thing, of course, has to do with turnout. And one of the figures, and the exact numbers may change because they're still counting votes, but that Harris got 230,000 fewer votes than Biden did in 2020, 230,000. Says a lot about turnout. And Trump only got about 1,500 more than 2020. So it wasn't so much Trump gained a lot as much as they didn't come out for Biden like they came out, or didn't come out for Harris like came out for Biden. There's another figure if you like figures. The country's biggest Democratic victories, generally there, Harris got 1.9 million fewer voters than Biden did in 2020 in those same places. Whereas Trump, in the Republican places with the biggest victories, Trump got 1.2 million more voters than he did in 2020. There's just a lot of those things, which again shows a lot in this case about turnout. So some people are asking whether this election shows the United States will never elect a woman. I certainly hope that's not true. I think most of us believe that Harris ran a very good campaign, but we'll have to wait and see. We do think there's certainly prejudice, and it's hard to know until we get in some other elections. Fortunately, we've elected women as governor and almost every position you could think of. But we do have to recognize that this president, just elected, ran a campaign heavily aimed at the male vote and consistently using misogynistic rhetoric for some of it pretty disgusting. We have to reject that kind of politics. The approach of a campaign that spent millions of dollars to divide us, to demean women, to make people afraid of immigrants, and unfortunately, in many cases, trans kids. You know, we have to recognize that this kind of politics is in the ascendancy, not on decline, at least at the moment. Trump increased his vote totals in each of the past 3 elections, making significant inroads this year with minorities, especially Latinos. especially but not exclusively male voters. We can see these inroads also across the board in Chicago, whether predominantly white, Black, or Latino. So clearly we need a more effective way of countering that kind of message. One way to think about this is the growing split between college and non-college voters. The Democratic Party once had the loyalty of working class voters of all ethnicities, as well as many of the most rural voters. The party has clearly lost this loyalty. Part of this stems from, one could argue, the pro-business free trade policies by the Democrats in recent decades that cost our economy thousands of manufacturing jobs. And then President Biden began reversing this orientation, investing in infrastructure, remember, clean energy, domestic manufacturing, but the economic policies take a long time to yield results. I'm sure Trump is going to have a good time over the next few years announcing all the programs that have been in the works now for the last couple of years. But that's one of the problems when it takes so long to get some of these infrastructure projects up and working. And part of this is also the skillful manipulation by interests that are no friends of working people to create a backlash against civil rights gains for minorities, women, and other disenfranchised groups. A major frustration of this campaign was that the Biden administration's sound economic policies, including capping drug prices and pushing against the overconcentration of corporate power, didn't resonate well with the people they were aimed at helping. But this was a fascinating thing because you certainly could argue that the Democratic Party, both local, state, and federal level, were very good on working class issues. Okay, they were always there and much better than Republicans in the vast majority of cases. The problem was they didn't advertise it that much. And my only analysis of that is a fairly simple when it comes to money. The Democrats also were very concerned about raising large chunks of money, including from the upper ranks of society. And I think we see a lot of that, not just in what happened this election, but across the board right now, where Democrats raised a lot of money, but they're also not always highlighting things with hindsight we see as terribly important. And that is like, losing working class voters is a big hit in this particular election. Trumpism, as we call it, is a form of right-wing populism. And populism is a focus on power and balances. But who has too much power? It's not women, it's not immigrants, it's not trans kids. That's just the scapegoating, which is a central feature of right-wing populism. The group with too much power in our country today is the 1%. That's the answer of progressive populism. And that's a new generation of progressive leaders have to find a way of cutting through all this noise and somehow making that clear. I'll keep going with some other little short ones here. A lot of people are voting for someone who's not a conventional politician, precisely because they feel that our political system isn't working for them. And they're right, at least in the premise, if not in the conclusion. Unfortunately, in many respects, we have democracy that's for sale to the highest bidder, and the election showed that this is getting worse. The presidential election saw an increase in spending by large dollar donors. According to the Brennan Center, individuals giving over $5 million spent twice as much in 2024 as in 2020. That's especially true of the Trump campaign as well, where those large donations actually tripled. For example, 3 Trump donors gave over 1 million each this year. 100 million each. And it's especially true of super PACs. Spending by the biggest super PACs, which operated under extremely weak federal rules, more than doubled from 406 million in 2020 to 865 million so far this year. That kind of spending undermines what remains of our system of campaign finance regulation. And under a remarkably bad new ruling recently by the Federal Elections Commission, super PACs, which are theoretically supposed to operate independently of campaigns, can now coordinate with campaigns on field operations. Elon Musk, his super PAC spent 175 million on field operations in swing states. And Elon, the richest man in the world, has billions of dollars worth of contracts with the federal government. He's now in line to head a commission, not sure what, unless it was announced today, but some sort of commission about government efficiency. Conflict of interest, anyone? Is this how a non-conventional non-politicians eliminates corruption? I don't think so. Campaign finance reform may be out of reach at the federal level for the time being, but here I'll make a local pitch that locally we have something that worth fighting for. The Chicago Fair Elections Ordinance is a prime example. I assume the league is somewhat involved with those attempts. So more to follow from Matt Martin's committee. We also face a lot of challenges the next 4 years. Two in particular are large in the coming weeks and months as this new administration gets off the ground. There's a threat, obviously, of mass deportations, which threatens to uproot friends and neighbors to separate families and upend businesses. We have to find ways to resist this in the courts and on the streets. And another threat, less dramatic, but also very important, is assault on the nation's civil service. Across hundreds of federal agencies, dedicated public servants protect our interests in a myriad of ways, safeguard the environment and food supply, workplace standards, and everything in between. The Federal Civil Service was established way back in 1871 to uphold competence and professionalism over political loyalty. Trump and Project 2025 have clearly aimed to destroy this system. We have to do everything we can in a nonpartisan way. Those of us in the Chicago and Cook County area, this should not be a real tough one for us, because in some ways that's what the old Daley machine did. Okay, you didn't really have civil service then. All the jobs were, not all, but most of the jobs were controlled by the political system, by the party, and demanded complete loyalty. And so for young aldermen at me many years ago, that was very frustrating. When you all know East Rogers Park, and it's crowded and hard to park, and not just women, but women and men fearful parking 11 o'clock at night. They can't find a parking place, and they see three cars that illegally parked with those tow stickers on them, and they're very frustrated, particularly if they, get assaulted. And yet, after taking his place for a while, and I confront the person in charge of towing in the 24th district, which was where I was, I basically said, "You don't know who I am, do you?" The point was, he was big clout and he did what he wanted, and he didn't give a crap about me or our voters. And again, I could go on, as some of you know, I could go on for quite a while about the evils of the machine, but that was part of it. It was a loyalty to the party. A loyalty in this case is what Trump wants. He thinks, because he had so many troubles with his previous cabinet and others in the White House, that he wants to get a hold of these thousands and thousands of jobs, which could be really valuable politically. But it would have the same damaging effect on the national government as what the machine did in Chicago. Anyway, that's I could go into more on that, but I'm not going to. Let me just say a word about minority rule, and then we'll get to questions. Okay. Particularly a minority rule in electoral college. I bring this up because I'm told, although I didn't see it on the news, that Nancy Pelosi said something today. Now remember, when you're discussing the founding fathers and electoral college, I think you all know, but just in case, let's just remind ourselves how all that happened. Okay. In other words, so why did we end up as the biggest democracy in the world with a totally undemocratic system when it comes to the US Senate? Okay, the US Senate, we picked two people. So again, California with 39 million people and Wyoming with a little over 1 million people have the same number of US senators. Well, that was all part of the slave constitution. Okay, and slavery at the time and the struggle. And so the compromise was the House will be elected by the people. But of course, at that time, the people just meant white men with certain income levels. And then the Senate would be elected two from every state. So the small states would not feel that they'd be overrun. I mention that because in the last several times we've had president elected by the Electoral College, but not a majority of the vote. Not in this case, Trump won both. But what I was told what Nancy Pelosi was saying, and given the margins that we discussed earlier, how many votes were lost for Harris that had gone to Biden before. And then she was pointing out that the Electoral College forces, particularly the Democrats in this case, to spend so much of the resources on those swing states, which they did unsuccessfully this year. But she lost votes and lost both turnout and votes all across the board. So the question I assume she was raising, if I heard this story right, was that, again, without the Electoral College, we still didn't have enough votes to win, but we might have been able to be in a different situation because if we weren't stuck just campaigning over and over again, you saw that how the Harris campaign would be in Pennsylvania, then Michigan, then Wisconsin, then in Pennsylvania again. But a couple of good stops in Illinois and other states, New York might have made a difference. Anyway, I'm just bringing that up. I wasn't there. I'm only getting secondhand information on what Nancy said. But it's important knowing this history and knowing the fact that we have a representative form of government. But the whole minority rules argument is simply that minority does rule, and we'll see very soon with the new administration what's going to happen and how they're going to deal with the filibuster and other kinds of things. So anyway, those are just a variety of comments on what happened. And now let's see what kind of comments or questions you have.
Great. We have a question. Please address the talk about how Starlink could or couldn't have played a role in the tabulation of votes.
Of what now? Say it again.
Starlink. That's Elon Musk's satellite.
Well, that's an interesting one. I have no idea of the answer to that. There's a lot about the spy work that we don't know. I'm not assuming it had any effect, but again, I couldn't tell you on that one.
Could you talk about where you see the future of ballot initiatives? They seem to have played a big role. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, again, that's one of the kind of a two-edged sword sometimes. Some people don't want to bother with that. Others, California, of course, were flooded with it. And certain ballot initiatives, the key is, in my mind, is how much money is involved often. Because what's happened with ballot initiatives can be a very good thing. Okay, we had a bunch in Illinois. Most of them were not binding. But you have the ballot initiatives, and particularly in California, where it's a question of money, then you're losing a lot. You're not really getting what the voters really want. You're just getting who's got the money to put up the arguments, and the arguments are not always sensical. But if you got big money behind them, they can be persuasive. So I think it depends on where and what. It's a way of gauging public opinion, which is important. But so let's put it like I'm for them. I'd love to be able to reform the other part of the system, which allows this money to flow in. It's kind of like what we had in Chicago recently with the school board. Now we did end up with electing some people that I think, at least if I've seen returns properly, are somewhat independent. But otherwise you had the teachers union with their massive amount of money, and you had the private schools with their massive amount of money. And that's what's happened in many cases with the initiatives.
So one word that's been used a lot to describe what happened is realignment. Can you talk a little bit about the realignment of the coalitions and what you think might have been the biggest drivers?
Well, let's go back to what we said a few minutes ago. Probably the biggest realignment was Latinos. Okay, voting in much bigger numbers they did for Trump than ever before. And what's driving it, obviously, all campaigns do a lot of polling and do a lot of analysis about how we might do this time. Clearly, Trump talked a lot more about trying to win back Black voters. He didn't do as well there. But Latino voters, he did. And so that means that goes back to the working class thing that I said before. Because many of the Latino voters in this case are working class. And I guess the main critique you could say for the Democrats is they didn't do a good enough job convincing these people. And whether part of it has to do with maleness, okay, and Trump's appeal there, although I don't know how he could, it's hard for me to deal with that because I can't think of anybody why they'd be attracted to Mr. Trump. But that's a big one. It's probably the biggest one I can think of at the moment.
So it seems as though abortion seems to have been uncoupled. People were very willing to vote in Missouri, for example, to get rid of their draconian abortion laws, but yet they vote for Josh Hawley and for Donald Trump, the people who pretty much served all of that up to us. Do you have any theories on what's happening there and what might be the future about abortion as an issue?
I'm not sure about a theory, but that's a very important issue. I mean, I think I fell into that like many others, that I was convinced that the reproductive rights issue was such a central one that it would have a bigger effect than it did. And it did have a big effect on winning certain referenda and so forth. But the fact that many of these people, like I said, voted for Josh Hawley, or many of those people, those women, they walked in and they voted for a reproductive rights initiative, and then they voted for Trump. So inconsistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. And I shouldn't say that because I'm not saying these people have little minds. It's just inconsistency we often forget when we're looking for consistent strains in our politics. Is inconsistencies are, that's who we are too. So I think it's just, people who are more successful in predicting things, okay, are the ones that look to start with no preconceived ideas, because it's so dangerous to do that. And this is a case where I do think, I feel like I was taken in by that. So I think it's just a lesson that good pollers know, poll takers and so forth, but you can't make any assumptions without testing them.
Okay, another question. It seems like, let me go back. It seems like Trump's support was focused on his persona rather than his policies. How well will this hold up as he is responsible for developments? How well will this hold up after he leaves the White House and other Republicans try to move into power?
Well, I'm not too worried about future. I'm worried about the immediate future and that what's he going to do. Again, I didn't say that in any open remarks, but I'm worried. We're in for some really dangerous times, very dangerous times.
Do you have any suggestions as to how to ensure that voters get accurate information as to candidates and issues in elections?
Well, I think that the normal, one thing that I'm not is I'm not that good, for example, on technology. Okay. And so I'm still good old fashioned, newspapers, magazines, TV for certain shows and so forth. So the bottom line is you want to get as much information as possible, and information that where you feel like you know something. If it's a leftward bent, you know that. If it's a rightward bent, you know that. You may respect the people, but you know that going in. So you have your own little guideposts on as you listen to the information. I couldn't speak for the modern things that many of the young kids are listening to, but that's bigger and bigger every day.
That's a good segue to the next question. Do you have any comments on younger voters this election? Did they turn out?
Let me go back one thing though. One thing when we see these things like the rise of Trump and the success of Trump, is we have to remember something's changed. The world never had, at least the world and the US world that we know of, never had a Fox News, and I'm not blaming Fox, I'm just saying we never had outlets of that kind of a nature that's so blatantly partisan. That's a new phenomena, and that makes it really difficult, particularly when it comes to misinformation and so forth. Not that liberal stations cannot be misinforming people in other specialties and so forth. But anyway, I just want to keep that in the conversation that we're still wrestling with this whole notion of having reporters that are right wing on no matter what, or basically telling mistruths or helping to spread mistruths. That's extraordinarily powerful force right now in the US, and we haven't figured out how to solve it. But I think your next question was how about young people? What about them?
Do you have any comments on younger voters this election? Did they turn up?
I don't have really good numbers on that. They turn out. They just didn't turn out the way that the Democrats had hoped. But again, it's like some of these other things, that understanding young Latino. I could just tell you a very close friend of some of my kids, okay, who were definitely not only in the camp, they were working for the Harris campaign. He's a young Latino, very machismo, so to speak, and they were just shocked that he voted for Trump. But
how big of an impact do you think the mis and disinformation was on the actual voting?
Again, that's something like the voter suppression. We need to do a lot of examination on that. I don't have any information that suggests it was big one way or the other. But again, those are kinds of, we know that Russia was involved. I'm guessing there were other countries involved, and a lot of misinformation. So we know the misinformation was massive. Okay, where it all came from, I don't think we know, or how persuasive it was. And the misinformation is not something that just comes up election day. It's a little bit like I was saying before when I, critique Fox News. But this, we know that other countries get involved. We know the Russians and others were paying certain outlets. I mean, there's been certain proof of that in the media. The question is how big it was. I think it could be much bigger than we have any idea of. It couldn't have not been but I'm saying it's something that somebody needs to be examining. It's not going to happen with the Congress. So whatever powerful forces individually or our best think tanks need to be trying to look at and decide that. And we're not going to get the information from the Trump White House. Can't answer it, but I think it's critical we find out. We need to know what we're up against. And that might be greater than we think.
Was there any positive change to how elections went this time that you can, I hate to be Pollyanna-ish, but is there something you can come up with, a positive change?
Well, I don't know enough about what the League of Voters was doing here in Chicago and Evanston and Wilmette and Skokie, but nothing grabs me at the moment. I thought a while maybe I'd come up with something.
Do we have any other questions? Betty, did you have one? Were you raising your hand? Yes, go ahead, Betty. You'll have to unmute yourself. Oh, she's typing. Yeah? Okay. Lots of misinformation came from the Trump campaign itself. Trump supporters didn't seem to mind that his remarks were lies. Should we be worried about the future of elections?
We should absolutely be worried about the future of elections. And we should be worried about the future, period. Maybe not all of, remember, when lie is a strong word, okay, and I've used it too. And truth is a strong word. But I mean, we'd have to, if we're doing that analysis right now, we'd have to factor out certain things, you know. You and I might look at the same statement and say, well, that's not really a lie, that's just kind of an opinion, et cetera. But I think there is great to worry about because of misinformation. It's been proven, again, not necessarily just in the election, but it's in the last few years, particularly what I was saying before about kind of picking on Fox News there, was we've never had this before. We've always had a certain amount of misinformation, or you get confused, or someone politically puts some points in that are across the line for their own political purposes or personal purposes. But this is much greater than that. This is extraordinarily serious, and it's an important step toward a dictatorial state.
Yeah.
So
the topic is called of our evening is called "What Changed on November 5th?" I wonder what you think the biggest, most impactful change was on November 5th.
Well, I think it's what's coming, but I'll just say, what changed? The biggest impactful thing?
The thing that I was wondering about is, are we in an era now where door knocking is considered quaint and passé? There didn't seem to be the emphasis on the kind of retail politics. Is that the wave of the future? Is that something that's changed?
I don't think that's changed. In other words, we lost. Many people who were kind of Democratic oriented thought that was going to be the reason why we'd win, is because we had a better ground game. Now none of us really know what Elon Musk did with the 175 million or how many other millions of dollars that he collected somehow. We don't know what he really did. But the key is that they got more of their people out. Okay, we even in the small rural areas, you don't get all your people out ever, but they did a better job of it than we did, and we had a really strong, and I'm sure people in the audience right here, or some of them might have gone to Wisconsin, or I wrote cards to Nevada. I mean, you have an activist group, and I'm sure people were doing things. We're always going to need that, but that wasn't enough. Even with it, we thought we had a much better ground game. There was something going on that I can't put my finger on it right now with the Trump campaign, and maybe I'm being too speculative here. One might simplify it a little bit and say, instead of just looking for answers why we lost, we should just point out President Biden was at 40%. And it's very possible that a short campaign, even as someone who, if you would agree that she was an effective campaigner, couldn't be overcome.
Have podcasts changed and perhaps supplanted the traditional notions of door knocking and other kinds of things like that?
Well, I think podcast is another form of politicking and so forth. I think, again, not necessarily changed. I still think the door-to-door stuff is critically important. What I say is I really don't know what Elon Musk did. But again, the Democrats, they probably did good because of that. But like I said before, I don't remember the exact numbers I've given you, but when you see how many millions less voted, I mean, Democrats didn't come out for Harris. And is that because they didn't think she could win? Is it because, who knows what?
Yeah. So Valerie Krejci has a positive outcome. She says, positive outcome is that the Dems will need to restructure and reach out and should be doing much more on the local level. And she says, I also think that there are good leaders ready to step up, but couldn't get through the old guard. Can you talk a little bit about sort of hierarchy and what role that plays?
Well, there's always a hierarchy, okay? And there's some young people that break through, or some new people that break through, and others that don't. I know some people that work carefully with the Democratic Party on some of these things, okay? And I would just suggest that they think there's a fairly strong elitism. That's why some of the people miss the whole point about young Latino voters and the working class voters. And so I think there's always going to be those kind of personality kinds of things. So one breaks through. Part of breaking through is just like anything else, it's luck. It's like luck in life, I'll pick on Gail Weisberg there. She might be a very talented person, but it doesn't mean she's going to get anywhere with a bad county clerk.
Yeah. So it's been a while since we had a big primary, right? I mean, that didn't seem to have played a role. Can you talk about, I mean, primaries are messy, but can you talk a little bit about primaries?
Well, primaries are messy, but it's a way of narrowing the field, which is critical. I guess what I think this was a losing proposition given how late this happened with Biden, and my analysis. It's all kind of like off the cuff. It's all current, but is that Harris was a good candidate, has the qualities of a very good candidate. So that comes together and is why it was very difficult to win. What I think many of us were hoping, that Trump would not be as successful as he was. But I mean, for many of us, Trump is a really kind of sick person. And so to see him do so well, it doesn't necessarily settle what I'm saying. The bottom line is we need someone like Harris or primaries. Primaries help, we get more talent. But if the key to making the best possible situation would be if the primaries themselves can be very helpful in narrowing the field, showing people what various candidates have to offer. But if we have some way of controlling the money part. Now, again, raising money is important. That should be, if you can't raise money, you're not going to go far. But in today's day and age, with so much millionaire money being thrown around, let's look at the new vice president that could be the president in 4 years. Okay, it's creation of basically one millionaire. That's what I'm concerned about. So it's a lot of this is just good old fashioned common sense, meaning there's the whole. You have to look at the whole thing. Okay, so the primaries are part of it, but if primaries are dominated by too much money, that weakens the process. But
many have wondered if when Biden ran, he said he would be a transitional candidate. And when he decided to run again, many people were very concerned. Christine asks, do you think that there would have been a different result if Biden had not chosen to run again and we'd gone full on into a primary?
Well, the answer is kind of like the same as before, is depending on who we chose. Okay. Was it someone chosen because there's a few rich donors? exaggerating, but so had we done the right thing, odds are that would have made a difference. How big a difference, it's hard to know. Joe Biden, did have his support, as we saw, and the fact that he did win in 2020. So I don't want to act like Joe was a weak candidate. He outstayed his usefulness. I guess that's the way to put it. So yes, a different primary, a different candidate might have made it much more difficult for Trump.
Will all of the leaders in the Democratic Party, or do you suspect that they will come to the wrong conclusions about all of the data, or do you think that they will ultimately figure this thing out?
Well, I think most of them are pretty savvy, and most of them, there's still a lot of, how can I put it? I think we could do much better with our Democratic leadership, put it politely. I mean, to be a little more forward-looking, not so traditional. But they have good consultants and good people, so I don't think they'll probably figure it out. What I worry about is to what extent they're trying to figure it out for themselves and their own personal battles and what office they're going to run for next, et cetera, versus how they're going to try and solve this problem. I mean, you might argue with hindsight that many of those Democratic leaders might have seen some of the stuff coming, that if your presidential candidate's going to be in the swing states every day for the last 3 weeks, maybe those people should have realized that they need to show more leadership and do stuff right here at home.
So the conventional wisdom is that you lose seats at the midterms. And I think everybody sort of expects things to sort of run amok, and that the midterms will be sort of a readjustment. As a former clerk, can you see any impediment to perhaps canceling a midterm? I mean, we had a pandemic and we still had an election, but is there anything you can imagine that would prevent the midterms from happening?
No.
Okay. That's comforting.
But I don't want to be too comforting, because in all the time we have to talk and so forth, this is so extraordinarily dangerous. Again, even from again, just look at some of the people he's appointed to office, and we're talking about some real, problematic folks. Okay, and he's only getting started. And again, he can also point all sorts of other, I guess in my mind, very weak, very narrow, very closed-minded folks that don't have to, the White House, that don't have to be approved and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I again, all the things that were promised, things were said. When I sit here and we're all rational, and we're doing these things, this is extraordinary, okay? Extraordinarily dangerous time for a democracy. So I want to at least say that at least once or twice, because it really is.
Do you anticipate any confirmation problems, or will they fall in line when it comes to the cabinet?
I think it's a little too soon to say. The cabinet's going to be some really, again, bad people. Okay. I mean, one of the ones that were announced so far, is the guy that, separated kids from their family at the border, and bragged about it, So what we don't know yet is what is their scheming? What in this case, what is the Republicans scheming when they say it's still close, the Senate very close. Okay, it's not a big thing. So they got to be very careful, and we got a couple of places like Maine and Alaska, where if I was them, I'd be worried about it. Depends on those two women and what they're thinking and how far they're willing to go.
You don't see any other spines, just in the women?
No, I think there's some others.
Okay.
But not a lot of spine in that group. I mean, the one that had a spine and lost it is being nominated for Secretary of State. Now, again, I'm not sure what their planning is. So in other words, how quickly can they have another election? I mean, if Rubio became Secretary of State February 5th, how close is the Republicans? I mean, their ability to govern and so forth. So again, it was not a landslide. It was shocking. In other words, shocking because of all those states that they did win. Okay, but the margins were still fairly similar. And had it been the same turnout as before, could have been a tie election. So.
But he'll call it a mandate and call it a landslide. Doesn't really matter, right?
It mattered. The truth always matters, but yes, they will. He was calling a mandate before election night was over, I think. But yeah, of course, they'll call it a mandate, and they've got some evidence of it. So I think it's a long way from being a mandate, but.
Does anyone have any happy notes to share? Or shall we end it on this one? Any questions that people have?
America's
come
back before from hard times, the Great Depression, World War I, World War II, the communist scare.
So you think we'll have elections again?
I am hoping so.
Okay, that's a positive note.
I'm going to do all I can to that end. So.
Well, thank you, David Orr. I appreciate your being with us this evening. I'm sure I speak for everybody who's with us tonight. Betty's giving us some claps, so we'll all clap for you. Thank you very much. We appreciate your spending the time with us.
My pleasure, Michelle.
Wonderful. Be well. And I hope to see everybody on December 8th at Maggiano's with Professor Dick Simpson. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.